Welcome to the next episode of Beyond the Bubble. And it's such a pleasure to have here a longtime friend who I had known for 20 years. And then we kind of lost touch and lost contact. And now we are back again. And there's a lot to discuss. A lot has happened in his life and in his professional life and in his self and world discovery. Alejandro, welcome.
Hi, how are you doing?
Such a pleasure to have you here. So we'll get started maybe with the basics that on the surface, you're a professor of European studies and negotiation and European political science. Mm-hmm. But as we will discover, you are far more than that. But why don't you say a few words about what brings you to Brussels again? Okay. And then we're going to go deeper.
Yeah. Let's start with, you just said, professor of European studies on the surface. I think that describes pretty well what I do on the surface, because this is what I normally professionally, that's what I'm doing, is when I normally say it's decision-making and negotiations. So I have two dimensions of what I'm doing. The first one is how decision-making is the process of decision-making in the EU. So I explain that. I explain that to the students and to civil servants, to diplomats, who I train. And then I organize simulations of negotiation. So there's the negotiating part that I do it by learning by doing. This is what I normally do as a lecturer. And so that I would describe my lecturing part. Then besides that, I have another life, very different, sometimes even contradictory, and I feel a bit schizophrenic about that life because sometimes very, very, very. We're going to talk about that. Normally, I like to be asked, and I feel always very uncomfortable talking about myself.
Yeah, don't worry, I'll ask you many questions.
So, and then your question on what I'm doing in Brussels. So the last time I lived in Brussels was in 2009 for 3 months, when we moved with my ex-girlfriend to Brussels, and I was living here for 3 months, but immediately I went to England, to UK, to study. So I only was, after my Oxford stint, I was 3 months here in Brussels. Why I'm back now? Because I always wanted to, in a way, but I always also wanted to explore life and the world. So I think I haven't lived in a place for more than 4 years in the last 25 years. Because no more than 4 years. That was my last residence was in France until September the 30th last year. So I want to build my life in Brussels now.
Very well, but there were some very far away places where you lived and when you learned special skills, not the kind of unique set of skills that Niam Leeson in Taken, but very different kind of much more peaceful ones. Yeah. But we're going to get to that. But before, tell me a little bit about, we were joking before the camera started rolling about the languages. So you're Spanish, and I asked if your main language is Catalan, or is it Spanish, or is it something else? And then you had said that there's more to it.
Yeah. This is a typical question from people that know the situation in Catalonia, where we have the Catalan and Spanish, and there is a certain friction between both languages. And then we are all bilingual. We understand Spanish and we understand Catalan. However, there's always a dominant language in our homes. There's always either the Spanish or the Catalan is going to be dominant, depending on the background of your family. The thing is, and that's the story I wanted to tell you, is that my mom's family is Spanish-speaking, and my granddad was born in Madrid, while my dad's family is very Catalan-speaking. However, my dad speaks Spanish because he changed during the dictatorship. He changed from Catalan to Spanish because certain classes, social classes in Barcelona, they thought it was nicer, cooler to speak Spanish, and then switched to Spanish from Catalan because they spoke Catalan at home, but they switched it. So I have part of my family of my dad that speaks Catalan with me, and I have part of my family of my dad that speaks Spanish with me, including my dad, and then my family of my mom, they all speak Spanish with me. So we always speak Spanish. So my mother tongue is Spanish. I spoke Spanish with my mom. I lived with my mom all my life. I grew up with her, so I spoke Spanish. However, I do see, and this is, I think, where it's related with, I do see the differences of the cultures, because my mom's family is very Spanish. and my dad's family, even if they speak Spanish, is very Catalan. So the way they speak Spanish is even different. The way they react, the way they discuss, there's a difference of culture. So when the people ask me if I feel Catalan Spanish, I do say both. I actually know the difference, and I lived as both all my life.
Can you point out some areas or some specific things where you say that culture it differs?
Yes. One clearly is the way we discuss. Spanish people are much more passionate in the way, and they interrupt even more.
Let me take that interruption for a second. Can you even say Spanish people? Because then you have the comunidades autónomas. So there's a huge difference between Galicia and Andalusia, or really different parts of Spain. So can you say Spanish people as a
whole?
group?
Yes, I do. I think yes. There is a Spanish culture. I like to define people not by the race or even by their ethnic group. That I still think boundaries are hard. I like to define them by culture. And I think cultural still boundaries are hard. However, we do have a very strong cultures that define our behavior. In Spain, we do have regional cultures and even national cultures. I think Catalan we can even identify itself as a national culture in terms of the history and the development and the structures and institutions, historic institutions. But we do have a Spanish culture also that we, Catalan, I think we share. At least many of us, we share. And we share Spanish. And we have this common culture, this common history that I think allow us to define ourselves as Spanish. I do believe in that. It doesn't mean that you have to have a unitary state or you have to centralize in Madrid. That's a different story. But I do think that we have a common culture that we can identify as Spanish, and we feel that identity. I do feel it, and I think many people feel it.
So going back to your point, Spanish people interrupt.
Yes.
As you
so
said,
Spanish people, I'm generalizing this. So this is all stereotypes, obviously. And we always have to take with a pinch of salt. However, stereotypes, they have a certain part that is true. And Spanish people, they are really passionate the way they discuss. They're very emotional, or emotional at least. And they attach a lot of emotions to when they talk, when they speak, especially when there is an idea they believe in. So when they are talking to you and we are talking, often we might actually be more interrupting when a point that you're saying we disagree with because we feel much more about it. I think Catalan culture is a bit more like Northern Europeans in that. Not us, Northern Europeans, but it's closer to where a Northern European would react to a point they disagree.
Okay.
And I felt that in my mom's family, these discussions became quite heated. Maybe it's my mom's family. I don't know. Maybe I'm taking from the specific to the general. But I saw it in the television. You see it, the Catalan television, when people are these debates and panels. You see a difference in the way the Catalan television, the people speak there, as in the Spanish television how they speak.
But when you compare Catalan culture or the defining operating system of Catalan people in general, and you say that it's closer to Nordics. Does that translate also into other fields of life, maybe work ethics, or maybe the way organization? Because in Spain you would say mañana, maybe in the Catalan world, so to say, much less, because a deadline is a harder deadline. It's not kind of an indication of when something would be completed or a project to be done. So how do you see this?
Well, I wouldn't say Nordic. I would say northern from Europe, because I think you can identify Catalan culture more with the Dutch, for example. I think there are many similarities with the Dutch culture. The trading culture. The Catalan culture is a trading culture. It's like trust is a very important element of Catalan culture. You need to trust someone, and the building of trust takes time. And I think in the Dutch culture also, you're very open, but still you're building the trust slowly. And then once you trust someone, you can really do business with it. The money aspect, how we approach money. I mean, we are known in Spain, the stereotype of the Catalan person in Spain is that very attached to money, like the stingy, like the Dutch, no? That we have that attachment to, or that relationship with money. The work ethics. I think in Catalonia there is a work ethic that it's dissimilar to some areas in Spain. in terms, and it's similar to what you would find in Northern Europe, meaning that 15 minutes, arriving more than 15 minutes late in Catalonia, that's very late. That's already late. As 1 hour in some parts in Spain, that's late, but there still can happen. Less and less. It changed. Culture changes. That was more, I think, 30, 40 years ago.
And that's something I want to go a little deeper into, which is culture, because not only for your job where you're teaching negotiation and you deal with the EU, and anyone who's ever looked the EU closer, just simply knows Europe, would know that with 27 countries, but far more cultures. Take Spain, just like you described, but there are many more regional, local, and other pockets of culture that have a big impact on how a person operates. So how do you see culture's role in the way people behave, how they approach negotiation situations, or just simply any professional context?
This is something in my courses I introduce often, and the idea of the cultural aspect of negotiations. At the end, a negotiation is a human activity. It's probably one of the most human activities we do. We do it since we are born. We negotiate because when we cry as babies, we are actually negotiating with our moms. When the food comes, and there's a negotiation, there's a timing of the negotiation. I want the food now. That's what cries means. Or I want to be changed now. That's what a cry means. And the mom has to interpret it, and it has to maybe do something, or stop doing it, and maybe wait. And there is a negotiation. There is a pull and push there. So we negotiate, and that's cultural. And culture plays a very important role in that negotiation, because culture is about norms that you expect. For example, you expect things to happen in a culture, and you expect things not to happen in a culture. So in a negotiation, if you come from a negotiation that is more competitive, more transactional, you expect people to be transactional. If you come from a culture that's more consensual, you expect people to be more consensual. So you will be surprised if you propose something and the person is not accepting at least some parts of it in that consensual culture. So that plays a very important role in negotiation. And that's related also with psychology. So everything is interrelated. So in Europe, I think that plays an important role. And I think every negotiator that's been in the council, every civil servant has been in the council, diplomat.
Council of the Ministers.
They would tell you the same at any level, especially at the level of working group. Culture plays an important role. Culture matters.
I get the sense that while we live in this continent and we interact with friends, with colleagues every day who really come from a very diverse number of or type of countries, we are not necessarily that knowledgeable about that aspect. We know certain stereotypes, and you pick it up as you interact with people, that someone from Bulgaria tends to be like this, someone from the Czech Republic tends to be like that. But in terms of the culture and what describes really in those terms, in a professional context, what describes that culture in terms of attributes, how that translates into the situation, how I should approach that particular situation. Diplomats, I'm assuming, typically are trained, and often by you, but then those whose direct job is not that, they don't really know this.
And they assume things. So that's the answer of the expectations. So expectations are about assumptions. We assume things to happen. We assume things are as we assume them. And that assumption is what actually is going to condition the way we negotiate with the other, we interact with the other. Because and even more dangerous. And something I say in my courses is that try not to assume things. Try to be critical with the way you approach facts and reality. Because if you assume things, then you are maybe going through a path that is not the right one. I give you an example. If I, for example, someone says, I want A in a negotiation, and I'm assuming the interest why they want A without asking, because I think the A plays an important role for them because of my culture, my background. It's not a culture, so my background, but different levels of culture, because we do have different levels of culture. We have our family culture, our professional culture, our national culture, our city culture. So there are many different cultures that are involved and interact. So if I assume A and I assume the interest of this person, am I assuming them? I'm not asking. I might actually take the wrong decisions because I'm actually maybe not concede them because I'm not asking. So I always say the questions are the antidote of assumptions.
Let me not so much challenge you, but but to say, well, in my view, the most difficult thing is I'm not even aware of my own assumptions. Hence, I cannot ask questions of what I'm assuming. So how do you reveal your own unconscious assumptions about the other person, about the situation?
This reminds me of Donald Rumsfeld. I don't remember.
The known knowns and the known unknowns. Kind of like a Johari window thing.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that?
No, can you?
So a Johari window is a concept in psychology where you say, what is it that you know about yourself and others know as well?
Okay.
And then there are the 4 quadrants. So I know something about you that you don't know about yourself. Because I noticed something or I realized something, but that's unconscious. And then there are things that you don't know about yourself and I don't know either. And there are things that only you know, but I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, not I, but it's others.
So you say, how is it called?
The Johari window.
Johari window.
And it's the same idea with a matrix of 4, like the Rumsfeld of the known knowns and the unknown.
But we can say what it is. I mean, Don Rumsfeld, when he was asked about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, there's a video on YouTube on that. He says, so we know the most dangerous things are the things we know we don't know. So you have the known unknowns, so the things you know you don't know. And then you have the known knowns, the things you know. But then the dangerous things and the most problematics are the unknowns, the things we don't know.
Yes.
And this is, it's interesting what you're saying, because in a way, what you're saying, maybe the antidote to unknowns and knowns is the interaction itself. Because if you know things I don't know, you, by interacting with you, I might actually start knowing them.
What I think happens in these situations is you want to move from the unknown into the known unknown. Now, before everybody gets lost with all these terms, what I mean there is the known unknown is I'm aware that I have certain gaps in my understanding. And I think part of in a training or
it's a different thing though. One thing is being aware, another thing is to know.
Yes, that's right. But what I'm saying is that you help others to say, listen, you have a knowledge gap here. Like I realize that I'm working with certain assumptions. I don't know what those are. I have a hard time finding them, but at least I'm alert to the possibility that I'm operating on default mode instead of being careful and trying to reveal those. And I think those conversations are super important, because otherwise you just go on a default mode I use, but in an automatic way into a negotiation, and then you fail because oh my God, why did that other
you follow the rules, you assume, you follow the norms, and you get into a place that you
exactly. So what do you do with that? How do you help people reveal
let
those
me backtrack a bit on the concept of awareness, because I think that's important. And that's the differentiation I think we were making here, is that one thing is you're aware of things happening, another thing is that you know what's happening. So being aware of something doesn't mean that you know what's actually happening, the details of it, but you know that maybe something is happening. It's like you're in the jungle and you can feel that you're aware that there's something that is not right in the jungle. You know what it is, but there is a movement, there is a sound, there is something you don't know, maybe it's not right. And then all of a sudden you see a branch moving and you see a tiger. Then you know that is a tiger. You see, awareness of the fact is when you are in a state, as you mentioned it, that you are trying to be open to a different situation you don't assume. So if I assume the jungle is safe, I will never really get to a point that I will be aware that something is not safe, because I'm assuming the jungle is safe.
Exactly. Which means, with your analogy, I don't even think about the possibility that a tiger could be lurking there in the back.
Exactly. So awareness starts with the opening your possibilities to things that you don't know, or to anything that you don't assume.
So you basically open yourself up to the possibility that there is more than meets the eye.
Exactly. Or your mind.
Or your mind.
Or your soul.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think that's the beginning of awareness. That's the beginning of awareness. Exactly.
And do you find that as a common reaction to your conversations when others come in with a lot of assumption, or they think that, well, I'm doing most things right, or other people operate the same way I do, and then you bring in that awareness, the possibility that, hey, there are more factors at play which are helpful to learn, because ultimately it's going to benefit you.
The thing is that there is a feeling of what I would call right now, I never call it this way, but I just thought of it, of the Socratic problem. And I call it Socratic problem.
Yeah.
As you know, Socrates said, I know I don't know anything. I mean, I know nothing. That's one of the typical things people mention. Why call it Socratic problem? Because when you feel you're aware of things and you feel the others are not aware, you become arrogant of your awareness. And then you start saying, oh, I'm aware. You're not aware. Oh, I can see you're not aware.
You lowly people.
You lowly people, not spiritually, whatever, aware, conscious, not conscious enough.
Right.
In the spiritual world, this is called the spiritual narcissism.
Spiritual narcissism.
Yeah, that's the person.
I love that such concept exists.
Yeah, it does. It does actually.
Meaning
it's
you
quite
feel
strong.
superior to the ignorant masses
Yes.
because you are an enlightened, conscious person.
At least a conscious, not necessarily have to feel enlightened because that's a very high step, but at least you feel you're more conscious than the normal person.
Right.
And then you go with this attitude, I know something you don't know. That's why I call a Socratic problem, because a Socratic principle that is that you actually don't know nothing. This is the ultimate awareness, is to actually, you don't know nothing. Even more aware you are, you less aware you are. And this is the paradox.
Right.
That's the paradox of Socratic paradox. Let's call it paradox, a Socratic paradox.
So I'm trying, as a thought experiment, just to interpret what you're saying, because I think there's
branches, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is going to take us far. But so essentially, you are here in this somewhat ignorant state, and we're not talking spiritual, broader things yet. We will get there, but staying within the framework of the workshops and trainings. But so you have this somewhat limited understanding of your ignorance, or even lack of understanding that you missed that awareness. But then you start opening up and say, okay, there are certain things that I wasn't aware of, and then they gain that knowledge. But that knowledge is obviously, in the grand scheme of things, is very limited. But if they think that, now I'm 5 notches further up on the knowledge scale, that gives a certain arrogance. Isn't that a little bit like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where when you know very little, you think you know everything. And then you start learning, then you gain a lot of confidence, and you think you know, but then there is this huge... What is it? A huge valley downwards.
And then you have the imposter syndrome. Because you feel you actually know less than you're apparently showing.
Exactly. And then it slowly starts climbing up when you really gain in awareness.
And then you don't realize you don't care.
You don't realize?
You just don't care.
Right.
When you start climbing again, you just don't care.
Just don't care about...
That you're aware or not. So I think the moment of awareness that you really are aware, you just don't care if you're aware or not, because it's so natural. It's like caring to breathe. It's like you don't go to people and say, I breathe, I can inhale, I can exhale. You don't go like that, and you don't feel special because you breathe. No, you do. I don't feel special because I breathe. I feel lucky that I breathe. But in a way, I think there's a moment of awareness that you're like,
so what? So let's keep doing.
You don't give lessons to people. I mean, and then I think that's a good analogy, because then you can, and in a way, that's what I do in my workshops. How do you teach someone to breathe? Because most people don't breathe well. I mean, breathing is probably the thing that people do, that everyone does, and most people do wrongly.
Okay.
And this is interesting because it's the most natural thing. It's probably the only thing that we share with all beings and not beings, because even the earth breathes. Even the stones breathe. So it's probably the only thing that everything in this universe does. But we do it wrongly.
But breathing in, we talk about stones and inanimate objects. What's the idea there in terms of the...
There is an exhalation and inhalation. That's basically that. That's what breathing is. They inhale and they exhale. There's a ventilation, let's call it this way. That's the breathing process. Yeah. The earth does it. Stones do it because there's oxygen and there's an exchange and there's a difference in the stone. And all inanimate objects do it, but especially life does it. There's no life that doesn't have a certain way of breathing. There's an inhalation and exhalation. Different ways, but there's always a breathing aspect. So when I'm coming back to the workshops, is that how do you teach someone to breathe if you think that you are actually breathing, feeling that you're breathing, what you are doing is good? You just show them how you do it. So how I do it. And also you tell them, you try to open different doors of possibility of you can breathe differently. It doesn't mean that what I'm breathing is right or wrong. or it's better or worse. It just is different. It might actually of benefit to you. So the same in the workshop. So how I teach, that's what I like learning by doing. I like simulations. I don't teach that what I'm saying is the best. You need to experience it. And this experience is when you learn how to do something, because you need to do it. We all have different types of breathing, even if there are ways of breathing better than others. But your breathing is going to be different than me. Even if I can't to teach you, I teach you how to do it. The same with awareness. I mean, my awareness is different than yours. It's always going to be different. However, there's a general thing. But how you learn how to be aware is not the same way I do.
Are you talking more about the path of increasing your awareness or learning something in a more generic sense? So is it the path or is it the result? So how you get to a certain place, or even the destination can differ greatly? Because I guess the destination differs greatly. If you talk not so much on breathing or other physiological methods and functions, but negotiation.
Yeah.
There are many good ways of negotiating in any context, and not necessarily just one way, but certainly there are methods that are better than others.
Yeah, but I think the destination is what we have in common.
Okay.
It's because at the end, the negotiation, you want to have an agreement you're happy with. And otherwise, why you negotiate?
Yes, but even that...
That's the outcome everyone wants.
Yes, but the outcome itself...
But the process itself, the path is different.
The path can be definitely
But the
different.
destination is the same.
Is it always the same?
The details are different, but the destination, the basics of it... Yeah, I understand what you mean. I mean, the details are going to be different.
Okay.
Because every circumstance is different, your needs are different, your interests are different. But the essence is the same. The essence is the same as breathing. The essence is to breathe and then to live. I mean, you breathe because you want to live. The same with a negotiation. You negotiate because you have certain interests that you want to be satisfied.
Right.
Everyone has. Otherwise, why do you negotiate? Might not be your interest. Might be your interest of someone you're a proxy of. But you are trying to satisfy certain interests.
But going back to, say, negotiation, it's an interesting analogy, and then we'll talk about it, all these dynamics in a more generic and other sense. But in a negotiation, you can have a very successful outcome for you, but it's not necessarily the same for the other. Yeah. And then you could zoom out a bit and say, well, successful outcome is actually not just a one-off winning, but a longer term relationship building that can yield more positive results down the line. So again, even that definition of destination can be looked at from different angles.
Yeah, yes, but why do you want to have that relationship? Because you want to satisfy interests you have eventually.
Correct.
So the final destination is the same. However, what you said is important. It's what we call the shadow of the future. I have heard this concept before.
No.
The shadow of the future in negotiations is when you have a future of negotiations with the same actors, with the same interlocutor, the same negotiator. So if I go to Istanbul, I go to the Grand Bazaar. Have you ever been in the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul?
No, not yet.
Well, the Grand Bazaar, is the center of...
I've been in Morocco, in Marrakesh.
Well, then a souk in Morocco. It's the same thing in a biggest way. A souk in Morocco functions the same way. When you go to a souk in Morocco, you know perfectly, there's a very high probability you're not going never, ever going to negotiate with the same person again. You go into the souk, you buy this thing, and then you go. As a tourist, as a Moroccan that live in the city, it's a different story. But normally these people don't go to the souk, to that souk you're going somewhere else. But if you go to that souk, that is a touristic area, people want to find the typical things that are Moroccan, you know that you're never going to negotiate again with that person. So there is no shadow of the future when you negotiate. So it's much more bargaining situation. We want something, and the other person wants something, and then there is a zero-sum game that if I pay you more, I lose what I'm paying, but I get what you're giving to me, so the object. So you lose the object, I gain the money. You gain the money. So it's a zero-sum game because whatever you lose, I win, and whatever I win, you lose. Sorry, the opposite. So whatever I win, you lose. Whatever I lose, you win. So this is zero-sum game. This is typical when you don't have any relationship to build with that negotiator, with that person, that actor. There is no shadow of the future. There is no future you have to think of. Yeah, but when you have a negotiation with someone that you think that you're going to negotiate again in the future, then you change your behavior. You are more in a more cooperative. Normally, you shift to a more cooperative, integrative, we call it, not bargaining, not distributive, but integrative negotiating mode.
Integrative refers to
integrating interest instead of distributing resources.
I see.
So we
basically,
distribute the resources or the outcome, and that's distributive negotiations. So the objective is to distribute. Integrative means the objective is to integrate your interests with my interests. It's more cooperative.
take employment negotiation. I want to hire somebody. Salary negotiation or the terms. That's definitely integrative because we're going to be working together afterwards.
It might, but actually it's a lot of bargaining there. It is depending. And this is interesting because some are, for example, a trade union negotiation that is a very bargaining situation because they already have the relationship built and it's very difficult to break that relationship. You might break it, and that's where when it's too much bargaining, that's what happens. It breaks the relationship with the boss, with the owner, and then there's a situation that has consequences in the future. But there is a moment that is a bargaining situation. You want something, and the other person wants something, and you need to compete about who is getting more. And then, yes, the good negotiator will come in the middle and say, let's bring it to the integrative. And this is interesting because this is related to what I teach in my courses, is that at the end, this is what the EU is about. You see, the EU, this is what I say in my courses, it's at the end, at the base of the EU, is a mechanism to change from a bargaining situation to an integrative situation. From a situation where we're competing, we were transactional, like I get Africa, I get these colonies, or I get these resources in the Ruhr. If I don't get what I want, I'm going to fight you. So eventually when the negotiations break, then you have war. And that's what happened until the 20th century. So what we did is we built institutions to integrate our interests in common, to find solutions. That's why it's called integrative negotiations, are called also problem-solving negotiations. Instead of bargaining about our competing interests or positions, actually, more positions, but also competing interests, we negotiate to solve problems that are common problems of all the members.
One word that immediately comes to my mind when you're saying this, which I think it's fascinating, is trust.
Yes.
And this really presupposes it's a fundamental that there's a base layer of trust in it. Yeah. Now, what happens if the trust is evaporating or gone?
Absolutely. This is exactly the pinpoints. One of the first things I do in my courses is I point to that trust. How you build trust and how you use trust to negotiate and how important that is. I always put this example. If I go and knock on your door with a gun and point the gun on your head, you're going to give me what I want because you are threatened, but you're not going to negotiate with me. You're just giving me. You're not negotiating. I mean, the most basic element of any negotiation is trust. I mean, if you go to Zug to negotiate it because you trust the situation.
Let me pause you here for a second. Yeah. What is trust?
Okay. Trust, you can define it as a situation where you have the confidence that the behavior of the other is at least within a range of your expectations.
So the behavior of the other in the range within your expectations.
With not your certain expectations of certain. No, it has to be your own expectations as a whole, but it has to be expectations that you use to trust that person. For example, you have a friend. Your trust is differently defined than if you have your mom. I mean, the expectations you have with your mom are different than the expectations you have with your dad, with your friends. Yeah. So your trust with a friend is going to be defined differently than your trust with your mom. That's why it can be broken. When it breaks the trust with mom, it's much stronger and harder when it breaks the trust with your friend. You can mend it easily, but the mend with the moms that's very difficult to mend.
That I think is a crucial aspect of it. And just to add to it, there was this fascinating TED talk from a baroness, I don't remember exactly her name, a short one on trust. And in that, from what I learned from it many years ago, and it keeps coming back, is not just trust as a blanket confidence in the other person or blanket confidence for the future, but to say trust to do what? Mm-hmm. Because I can trust you fully that you're not going to kill me in the studio and you're going to be a great guest and we're going to have good, meaningful, deep conversations. But I don't necessarily trust you with walking my dog.
Exactly, the expectations.
Right?
You don't expect that this is margin. The margin, walking your dog is not in the margin of your expectations.
Right. So the margin also defines the scope of the trust.
Yes. It's the range. The range of your expectations. Okay. Let's call it range. The range of expectations is what defines your trust on me.
Okay.
and vice versa.
So now we have that out of the way.
And that's interesting because that can change. That can be different. So your range of expectations might be different than mine. And that might be a friction there.
Which
Because you
is-
expect things that I don't expect from you, but I don't know you expect those things. So when I do things that you assume I have to do, I don't do them, you're surprised that I don't do them, and you mistrust me, but I don't know why you mistrust me because I don't know why you expect that from me. Like, for example, you expect me to walk your dog, you ask me and say, why should I walk your dog? And you're surprised that I'm not doing it.
So hence we're going back again to
Yeah.
the assumptions,
Uh-huh.
and we go back to voicing it, or the
Yes.
being aware of my
Voicing,
being aware even of my own expectation. Because let's say I go on a holiday and I say, well, Alejandro, you can stay in my house.
Yeah.
And then my assumption is, well, I have there the dog. Well, I'm sure he's going to realize he needs to walk that little dog.
Yeah.
And you say, I've never had a dog. I don't care about dogs, whatever.
I'm ignoring completely that because for me, it's not something within my range.
Exactly. So now we have that kind of out of the way.
Yes.
So we have trust.
And that's what contracts are for.
Right.
Contracts are for to put to voice what you expect from the other.
To unearth those
Yeah.
assumptions and
Yeah.
everything.
That's
so
why
we
it's
have,
so important.
So we have trust, we have assumptions, we have all of that. So going back to the earlier point, where did we leave that off with where we got into the
in
trust?
the shadow of the future.
That's right.
We were in the shadow of the future.
Exactly.
So and then the why we build integrative negotiations because we want to be more
Yeah.
cooperative. Because
Yes.
it's the point that I was making out of the EU that I think is quite interesting.
Yes.
Because what happens with integrative negotiations, they're much more expensive than distributive negotiations because of the trust. Because building trust for integrative negotiations, it's much more costly in terms of the resources you have to invest on that.
So you mean the time or just the effort? To
The
build
effort, the
trust?
time, the questions, the resources, the people, the kind of things you need to do to be shown that you trust the other person, and the other person need to do to you to be trustable. I give this example in my courses that is like, imagine just to represent both things, the integrative negotiations and the trust itself. So I say, imagine you, Andres, and there is a cake. We bake a cake. Okay, we have the cake here, and then we said we need to share it. And I say, I want 60% of the cake. So, wait, we bake it together and 50-50, but I insist I want the 60%. Actually, I insist I want the 100% of the cake. That's what I want. And you're like, what? I mean, there is a competition there. So that would be a bargaining situation. My position, I want the 100%. And then your position, I want at least half of it because I want half of the cake. So that would be bargaining. That's easy. It's in terms of what you want and what I want, meaning the negotiation is already happening. But imagine I want the integrative negotiation. To integrative negotiation, you need to define my interest and your interest because we haven't defined them yet. We know we baked the cake. We know we want the cake, but we don't know why we want the cake.
So the interest equals the why?
No, the why is the beginning of it. Okay. So it helps to build it. So what I will do is that, imagine I ask you, why do you want the cake? That's the questions I was telling you.
Because I'm hungry and I love cakes.
Exactly. You want to eat it. And I say, now I understand. Wait, I don't want to eat it. I have a photo shoot. And I want to take photos of the cake. That's why I need the whole cake. So if you give me the whole cake today, I do the photo shoot, I bring it to you, you can have 100% of the cake. I don't want it. So you want to eat it, your interest. I want to photo shoot it, my interest. So by expressing my interest and your interest, we can enter into an integrative negotiation that's satisfying both interests. That's why it's called win-win negotiation, because we both win. There's no loss. However, what's the problem with that? And that's what I was saying. To get to that point, you need to trust me. Because imagine I say that, and I go to my home, I eat it, and I don't bring it anymore. And you are 0%, you have 0 cake, and I have 100% cake.
So I need to trust that what you're declaring as your interest is actually your interest,
Yes.
and I need to trust you that whatever you are promising to do with that cake, you're actually going to do that. So
How do you do it? How do you do it?
Well,
How would you do it if you want 100% of the cake, and I want 100% of the cake? And I'm telling you I want for free. What would you do?
In that
I'm
situation.
aware of friends. We know and you trust me already. But imagine there is no trust. What would you do?
Well, I would try to think about how to build that trust. I'm assuming.
How you do it?
I think there are many variables in that.
Okay.
Probably, well, do we have a backstory?
No, it's not backstory.
No?
It's just
Not too
something
complicated?
in the future. It's nothing in the
Okay,
past.
good.
What
I
you
want-
can do in the future that can at least facilitate that you can trust me that I'm going to bring back the cake.
Probably get some safeguards, and that could be another person. That could be an
Insti-
escrow payment, a
Exactly.
deposit. It
Yeah,
could be
absolutely.
a camera in your kitchen
Yes.
to make sure you're not
Yes.
eating it, but you're photo shooting.
Yes.
I don't know.
Rules and institutions.
Rules and institutions.
That's what you're doing. It's crook what it is, an institution. What's the police? It's an institution. What's the judge? An institution. What's the rules? You're going to bring me the cake at this time of the day, tomorrow. And you have a situation how to process with this crook. There's a rule too. Rules and institutions are the mechanisms the human being uses to build trust, that we have continuous negotiation that can extend to the future between the different actors, the similar actors. That's exactly what the EU is. That's exactly what the EU is, if you think about it. That's actually the EU. That's
The
how.
system.
We build the system of rules and institutions to trust each other, because the alternative was war.
I 100% get that,
Yeah.
and I really support the concept around it. Now, what reality is of course far more complicated because there's more cynicism, there is more backstabbing, there is more overt or covert violation or circumvention of the rules. So there's obviously the political reality becomes much more complex, and there are some bad faith actors, and we generally know who they are, who just don't pay by the rules, but basically they abuse the trust. So they say, hey, I'm in the system, and
Well, you have the free riders.
the free riders,
Yeah.
exactly.
When you have
So-
a common good system, well, that's what the EU is. It's a common good system. You have always free riders, people that were trying to free ride the
free
collective
ride,
good.
even say cynically exploit, so to say, by the nature of it. And again, we don't necessarily talk politics in the sense of EU. Obviously, that's our starting point.
Yeah.
But in any context, especially if it's a high stakes, and that could be multilateral negotiations in a UN forum, but it could be even a business context where you're renovating your house and you're talking with the entrepreneur and your architect and your lawyer and your whoever, right? So there are competing interests, and some may exploit the system you put in place to gain the most.
Always you will have that danger. It doesn't take off virtue of the system itself. I think the system has its virtues. I think that every system that tries to create a collective action system, that there's a collectivity that acts together and cooperatively, is going to have its own share of free riding and abuse. Always you're going to have that. I have a very liberal institutionalist perspective of all this. I'm a liberal politically. I believe in freedom as the most important principle of human action. Without it, there's nothing. But also I believe the freedom, how we build that freedom together as a collective, we do it through institutions. And institutions are the mechanism we can really guarantee that freedom to happen and to be free, actually free, through responsibilities, etc. So, however, you do have behaviors that are going to go against that. And the option is, and that would be my option, is that then you change this, you shift, you change, you tweak the institutions. You have to keep. It's a machine.
But jointly, I think
Jointly.
that's the crucial part there,
Yes.
because one individual or entity, whatever you want to call it, should not and cannot change it single-handedly, because it's a collective action system. And even collective action can mean 4 individuals who go on a hiking trip, but they still need to create a certain system, whether spoken or just, ideally spoken, not necessarily written, to say, here's how we're going to cooperate. Because ultimately, it's the cooperation and the ultimate benefit to the community and to the individuals. But if one of them single-handedly doesn't play by the rules or wants to change the rules to benefit that actor, then it can disrupt the entire system. Absolutely. And here's where most liberal systems are struggling, because the rules are not being either respected or, even worse, not being enforced. And the minute that some feel that the rules are in place, they're great, but they're not being enforced, then the system, the trust in the system and trust in the other starts to erode.
So the problem is not in the institutions, it's in the enforcement.
In the enforcement.
So the problem is the political will problem of being enforced. And it's understandable in a collective situation, because if you have to decide together to enforce, maybe not everyone wants to enforce them in the way you are expressing the enforcement, and you want to be enforced.
So
That's
even
what
if-
happens in the EU with the ones we know.
Yeah.
I mean, a situation where not everyone would vote for enforcing the institutions or the rules that we have.
That's exactly the issue. Because
Yeah.
even, and again, we can talk macro level European Union, but we can talk micro level of family.
Yes, yes. I actually I like to use another example, because the problem with families is the emotional attachment we have, and that disrupts a lot of
Yes.
thinking. I think I like to use the neighbor community. So you have a building, I know how you call it in English, because we...
La copropriété.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Copropriété. It's
The-
comunidad propietarios in Spanish.
Right.
La copropriété. So we have these neighbors, they live together.
Yes.
They have to live together. There is an option. Either you live or you live there.
So basically, it's a large house with multiple apartments.
Multiple apartments, and then you have these meetings every year or every 6 months, wherever you want to, and you decide on the collective or what the works you have to do, and the owners meets every X time, and they decide together the collective. And if there is a free rider or at least a disruptor in the neighbors, you need to deal with it. And sometimes the community doesn't. The copropriété is not doing it properly, because the majority of the neighbors, they don't care. And then you don't have a copropriété anymore. You have basically some neighbors living together in the same building. And this is the danger the EU has. And coming back to that, I mean, if you link with that this is the danger of any collective institutional framework or institutional organization has.
Yeah.
Like the copropriété is nothing else than a collective organization.
And then it becomes, and for 1 second, I think the copropriété is a great example. Yeah. But for 1 second, I thought about the UN. And you take the UN, which was, and I'm more tempted to say that in past tense, to my greatest regret, but it was a great idea. But now, if you look at certain UN bodies where countries, let's say with the worst human rights record, are basically taking over human rights fora inside an institution, whereas others either don't care or they cannot enforce certain principles. And my point there with this example is that when it comes to principles, then it becomes more tricky, because it's not about, do I cut this cake 2 slices or 30%? Very concrete, measurable way of performing or doing it. But principles are much more malleable. Is it equal rights? Is it about human rights?
Because if they are the word principle, it's very interesting, because we use them like they are not principles. But the principle is something that you base things on. But we actually, nowadays, we talk of principle, something, a destination, instead of something that is the beginning of something.
Okay.
So the human rights, it's like we will get to the human rights. No, you have the principles because you base the whole system on that. So if you don't respect the principles, the system doesn't work. And this is the problem with the United Nations. I mean, there are many problems. I agree with you. I think it's a wonderful idea, badly implemented in this case. This is really clearly a case of, actually, even the idea itself perhaps is not well defined completely. So when you have a situation where members of the organization don't respect the principles the organization is based on, then the whole system cannot work, because these are the principles. It's not like you want to get to those principles. It's like, in the case of Iran, they were chairing the Human Rights Commission, I don't know, for some time. I mean, it's a joke. It's a joke. Human rights in Iran is a joke. Because
at least at the time of recording, we don't know when.
Yeah, well, maybe in the future. Maybe I hope in the future it changes. I'm very pessimistic right now, but I hope in the future. I'm very much. It's a case that I'm kind of, emotionally attached. I had a girlfriend who was Iranian. I visited a couple of times, and I like the country, and it has a history that is an amazing history. And it's really a beautiful culture, beautiful civilization. It's a shame to see it as it is today. That's why perhaps I'm more emotionally attached to it. And the case of Iran chairing the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations is a joke, because how do you want those rights to be respected if the one that's chairing the meeting is actually the one not respecting it? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, you cannot have that system. Yeah. So I was telling to a friend, I was saying, I don't believe in the United Nations right now. I mean, I think it has to exist, but I don't think that with the things the United Nations is doing is not possible to do. So we need a liberal organization. a liberal organization that is joining together the liberal countries that respect the principles, kind of an EU for the world. And then if you don't respect those principles, you cannot be part of it. It's the EU is the case. You cannot be part of the EU if you don't respect principles. Spain and Portugal, we know perfectly that. We were not members, even if we applied a long time ago, members a long time before. We're not members until we had a democracy in Spain or in Portugal. Why? Because we didn't respect the principles the EU is based on. So the United Nations is having principles, that's what they're based on, but there are members that are part of the United Nations that are not respecting those principles. That is not possible to work.
Which then takes us back to the whole dynamics in a negotiation where, and the way smaller, larger systems can successfully operate to the benefit of all and for the benefit of a joint outcome or jointly positive outcome. Yes. And if those principles are not respected, definitely. Then the system starts cracking.
Yes. And I think coming back to the copropriété thing, it's like saying to they do it in the States more often than in Europe. If you don't have a certain type of, if you're not a certain type of person with certain principles, you cannot be part of this copropriété. You cannot buy this flat. You cannot rent this flat. So there's certain entrance door or entry requirements to get into that building, because they know if you don't have those principles, you cannot. You're going to disrupt the whole system.
And I think this approach, and I don't know if this is a proper use of the term first principles, perhaps, where...
I think it's related, yeah.
I think it's related, where it's even starting some form of cooperation, and you just look at Ukraine and Russia, and you can look at a host of other conflicts, but even in our everyday lives, there needs to be some ground rules which both parties, or if multiple parties, they need to accept it. Yes. Otherwise, there's just no point in sitting down at the table. Yes. And then, sadly, what's the alternative to that is violence. And that can be in a...
This is the dilemma problem. That's why the United Nations...
Which one, though?
That's the dilemma.
Yeah.
That's why we have the United Nations. Because if we don't have a system that, first, these principles are not so important in terms of access to it, then those that are not respecting the principles are outside, the barbarians. And those barbarians will create problems. That's why the United Nations. I think that's the main reason of the United Nations. And by not to have the barbarians outside the gates.
Barbarians essentially means those who resort to violence instead of
anyone. I'm not talking a specific culture. In this specific, I'm not saying that the Iranians are barbarians. Quite the opposite. Right. And not to. No, I'm saying that the barbarians are the ones that don't respect the principles you believe in.
Yes, and again, just to that point is the anything before violence is the way to go. Because when an institutional setup or conversation, however heated, however intense, and however tough it is, when that ends, violence begins.
Yes,
and that was that is the fundamental idea in the EU, and that is the fundamental idea behind every institution of that kind. But even in a colloquial, let's say everyday setting,
yes.
It's you want to settle things by the court and not to be your own executor.
However, at the ultimate tool is violence.
It's violence, but it's not in your hand.
It should not be in your hand.
Should not be in your hand, right?
But sometimes it can. It has to be.
Well, sometimes
that's what Americans understand very well. That's the Europeans don't understand. And I think this is an interesting point because Europeans, according to our history, we separated ourselves from violence in ways different than Americans did. I mean, for them, violence in American culture is freedom. Not to every American, especially city, coast, but especially inside the inland, violence in terms of the use of violence means the guarantor of freedom. If you don't have, that's what the arms and the whole thing and the amendments, because they guarantee they can use violence in the ultimate situation that you are threatened. Because if you don't do that, you're not free. And this makes sense because it is true in ways that we don't understand in Europe because we are privileged. But because we have already not have wars in the continent, in the Western Europe particularly, for a long time, and we think violence is something we should get rid of. No, that's not how it works. Violence is something you have to get rid of. It's something you need to be able to use it when a situation is in such a situation that you need. The only way of defending yourself is using it, and that's this dilemma we have now in Europe. We've been protected by the United States since 1945, and we thought it was not necessary to have those nukes and those military because we live in a world that it was so happy and so great. While the whole world was killing each other, the Kumbaya world, but the whole world was killing each other at many different levels. And then all of a sudden, Russia invades, not yet what we call the proper, the Europe EU, but in the borders, and we start thinking, well, if America doesn't protect us, who's going to protect us? But you can go to anywhere like that. I mean, if you have your house and a home, but who's protecting your house and home? It's the police. It's the army. Without those two things, your house won't be protected.
Absolutely. And just to your point, I think it's the fundamental difference in how we view, we, meaning Europe versus US, the role of the state.
Yeah.
Because when you say, well, I can ultimately count on the state to protect me, be that if I have a burglar or violence that I need to be protected from, or be that a third country that is attacking our territory, versus can I count on the state? Should I count on the state, or do I count on myself? Yes. Because ultimately, when things go from bad to worse and someone is threatening my life or that of my family, I want to be able to have the agency to protect that.
That makes sense in the American history. That's how Americans built their country. They didn't build the country because they have states. They built the country because they had guns. And they had the will to use them when it was necessary. And they had also a way of extending their territory using the possibility of using that to defend themselves to extent. Actually, the United States was built against the states because it was built against the England or UK. And it was the states. And the freedom came from society, from the civil society organizations and leaders that bottom up, and they organized a system that they thought we cannot trust the state 100%. Because if we trust the state, meaning the UK or England, and then we are not going to be free. And Europe is very different. It's the opposite. And that's the role of the king. He was the protector, the primus inter pares. There was the protector of the nobility, but also of the peasants. And then that was the protector of the population, even of your own religion. I mean, that was the whole Westphalia Peace was about my religion is different than yours. And in my territory, that's my religion, not yours. And therefore, I'm going to protect the persons who have my religion as a state.
It always fascinates me, just to kind of zooming out a bit for a second, how... What exactly what we're discussing, because we're jumping hopefully in a logical and in a manner that can be followed, but we are really going from the very personal, meaning from awareness all the way to how communities work together through trust and belief in the institution or cooperation that they create according to their needs and their desires. And all the way to the macro level, where countries and continents cooperate or not. Yeah, and because that really it all exists on so many levels.
Yeah, and in a way, it's related to what you were saying about the first principles. Why they are connected? Because in a way, there's some principles that are shared among all of these things, and the method of the first principles is good at. Go and take the superficial aspects of all this. And that's perhaps what we also should do with our conversation itself. I mean, we go from one to the other, but we need to be able to go back to the principles that inform what we're talking about.
Exactly. Now, that's what I was going to turn the conversation towards, because when you talk about principles, and we're not talking, say, culture codes on societal levels, but on an individual level, for instance. So when you say your political view is of a liberal, in a classic liberal, we could say that?
It's called liberal institutionalist.
Liberal institutional.
I'm not the Millet liberal, let's put it this way.
Yes.
It was to destroy institutions. The more that I believe institutions and the government, and I believe, but not the abuse of it, but in the benefit of freedom. Never on the benefit of the collective. I don't believe in the collective over freedom. I believe in freedom over the collective. I think the collective is great, but it will never should be sacrifice your own free individual freedom because of the collective.
And just as a footnote here, because the terms are so interchangeable, and this will be hopefully listened not just in on our continent. So the term liberal in the U.S. has a very different meaning, especially today, and now it's even used as a
very good
sort of
it's as you say, the classical liberal.
The classical.
Term,
like the Montesquieu type of separation of powers.
Classical liberal.
Yes, of
unlock
institutions.
freedoms of the individual freedoms, the property, and that's the classical liberal. Definitely.
Right.
From that perspective, yes.
So now going back to that, and really to hone in on the principle side, where do, and again, not necessarily you, but generally, where do our principles come from? Is that an intellectual idea to say, well, my principle is I believe in the rights of the human, the individual, and many other things that derive from that, or is that something which goes deeper? Is it coming from general universal principles?
That reminds me, when I think of that, it reminds me always of my first years in the law, in my law degree, and the idea where the rights came from. So where rights, actually where law comes from, where is the origin of law? And traditionally, there was this idea, and that's the theological origin of law, of rights, of human rights, and law in general, but you can be specific on human rights, because that was used specifically for that too. So human rights, what's the origin of human rights? And the theological perspective, it comes from God. So God gives the human his rights or her rights, or their rights. And it gives them, that's why, and then there's we need to interpret what the law, what God wants to put it into paper, and then we have the human rights. That's the interpretation of the natural rights. That's what it's called, natural rights, because it comes from nature, God, whatever, it comes from something that is beyond the human. And then there is more the positivist perspective. And the positivist perspective doesn't believe, or doesn't need to believe in God or nature giving you rights, but it believes that basically the human is the one creating the rights. Is the one we create the right positively. We create the rights and we write the rights. We decide are the best for us.
Basically, it's just an idea.
It's an idea, exactly. It's an idea you create. It's not given to you by God or nature.
It's not coming from anywhere.
It's come from ourselves.
If anywhere, it's just a mental exercise.
Exactly. It's a mental exercise, an idea we create to have a better life. And that's my perspective. Still, some people, interesting enough, most people think in the first way. So when you ask the people, they have the right to this, they believe they have the actual natural rights, they have it. But then again, from my perspective, it's not true. Because from my perspective, you have the right because these things exist. Again, the institutional aspect of it. Because there are institutions that guarantee your rights to write them, to put them on paper and guarantee them, you have them. Without those, you are in the natural state. That's the Rousseau natural state. And that's the Rousseau's perspective. There's natural state and the non-natural state, the one that's civilized. So he was more critical of the second. So Rousseau said that, but actually he was more into natural. So he said the nature of the human being was good. So he preferred the natural than the civilizational being or the human. So, but in a way, that division is important because, from my perspective, I have a more Hobbesian perspective and say, okay, natural state is not necessarily good. It actually can be exactly horrible. It's not good or bad. It's just what it is. So, if you don't have those institutions, you go back again to the natural state. And that's not what you want to do because they, as you say in America, they ain't rights there.
Right.
Because it's not natural.
My thoughts on that, I broadly agree with you, though I would add to this, and I don't know if that contradicts or not, you'll tell me. But certainly there are certain ways, laws, and again, not to confuse laws and rights, but there are certain laws of nature. There are ways that the world, the physical world, the social world, the individual human, statistically speaking, this is how it operates.
Yes.
And there are always deviations, and there's this Gaussian curve and all that. But the main way, there are certain ways life is. Now, if you go strictly and harshly against it, you're not going to do a service. You might succeed in the short term, but you're not going to succeed mid or long term. You take, I don't know, communism. Well, communism thought that, well, we can reprogram the way humans cooperate. We can rewrite the way economics works. We can do so many things, basically social engineer in a certain way, in many ways that went against these laws of nature. And those need to be understood to the degree that's possible. And those needs to be respected, meaning you create your laws in relation to those and not against those. And that essentially often means maybe tame your ambitions. In some sense, you should be ambitious. You do want to give equal rights to men and women. You want to make sure that the human flourishing is coming to its best, whatever way you define human flourishing. But you need to respect certain framework in which you operate, and not to create laws or create rights, if you will, that are fully contradictory, because it's just simply unworkable.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And this is the other side of the coin. So on the one hand, the rights that we give ourselves are created by us. On the other side, there is the laws of nature that is not created by us. It's actually there, and we do what we do within those laws of nature. We cannot go against them. That's what it is. It's the things that it is, the objective truth. That's a way of believing there is an objective truth. There is a truth out there that is beyond us, and we cannot change it. And we need to work with it instead of going against it and trying to change our reality through that. And that's the interesting thing, is that often the same people that think that we have the right to do something, natural right, he thinks they can change actually the natural laws, and they can ignore them. So it's like, I have the right to be equal. Where does it come from, that right? But I don't believe that men and women are different, for example, biologically different. I don't believe it. Since I don't believe it, that law doesn't exist because I write it off. So it's a bit of paradoxical. It's the opposite I'm saying. So I'm saying actually the first is not...
Inconsistent reasoning.
It's inconsistent reasoning, because on the one hand, there is a natural law that's the right you think you have. On the other side, there's no natural laws because you can change them, and it's malleable and it's in your heads. Either everything is it's actually the opposite. These natural laws are not in your head. They are objective truth. At least that's how I believe. And as you say, there is the physical reality that we need to work with. But on the other hand, this social construction of laws and rights and realities that we're building. But it's a social construction. But these two exist and coexist. And one is not over the other. Actually, social construction is under the physical laws. And this is what the humility aspect of it is. And that's related to our first conversation about awareness and the humility of awareness. Once you're aware that this reality, this universal reality exists, you cannot feel you are superior to that and you want to change it. You can't. You definitely can. You see it as you see everything. You see, I'm not going to change it. Actually, I'm going to work with it, as you were saying.
Now I'm happy with this last sentence, or the last words you said, that to work with it, because often one would suppose, having heard everything we've said in the past couple of minutes, that this means a kind of laissez-faire, or kind of giving up, losing hope. That say we shouldn't be ambitious in the kind of life we want to construct, or the kind of societies, or the kind of values we want to nudge societies towards, because anyways there are certain constraints which we cannot supersede. So basically back to the Middle Ages and just let things be.
Absolutely. This is, again, it's abusing the idea. I like this concept of abusing ideas. It's like abusing the idea of equality. I mean, equality is great, but you can abuse it.
Meaning push it to its
you
extreme.
push it to a extreme that doesn't, it goes over common sense. Or diversity. I mean, it's like thinking something is good and there is no possibility it's going to be bad at any time. It's like alcohol. It's like thinking
it's like a linear scale, and it can only be bad.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, you can abuse it and it's fine. It's like an alcoholic. I can drink as much as I want. It's fine. No, it's not fine. These ideas are like drugs or alcohol. You can drink a little bit, you can take a little bit, and it's fine, it's okay. But if you abuse them, it's going to have pernicious consequences, and it's going to be negative on the consequences. It's not about itself is good, intrinsically it's bad or good. It's the consequences of it are good or bad. And I think this idea of thinking that, yes, natural laws of nature are there, so we cannot change them. So it's the idea of the fate. It is fate as it is. So what's the point of my life? I need to just like a train, be on my rails and continue straight. That's what laws of nature say, and we cannot do anything else. That's not true either. That's an abuse of the idea of laws of nature. First, because it starts from an idea that is wrong. The idea that we know the laws of nature. We don't know them. So therefore, if we don't know them, it's not about changing them. No, it's like how malleable they are. We don't even know what's the range of our actions. So if we don't know the range of our actions, we can do many things still. And we are still working and exploring, it doesn't mean that everything is available to us, but the range is so huge that many things are available. It's just not trying to go with something that, as you say, communism is the case. Something has been proven over and over again that is wrong. Now, if something is proven once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, you cannot keep saying, no, it's the application that is wrong. The idea is right. No, it's not the application. The idea is wrong. So change the idea and then change. It's like the range of possibilities are not the ones you think are. You just change to do something else.
The sad thing in human history is that a lot of ideas and a lot of methods have been proven wrong, and yet they keep resurfacing because we don't seem to
interpretation. Because we interpret to assume different things.
But I actually have a question which I wanted to throw at you, which is, do you think it's a little philosophical, but do you think it's even possible to learn to understand these laws of nature to a large extent?
In general, I mean, we understand many.
To what degree are we able to?
Well, that's what science is about. Science is about approaching ourselves to know the laws of nature, because our method before was religion. And we have religion. That was the idea, the way we knew about nature. I was religious. Basically, if you think about it, religion is the way we interpret nature. Any religion is that. I mean, beyond the theological aspect of the theos and of the superior being or wherever, in a way, every religion is about how you interpret the things that are outside you and the natural aspect of it, how we interpret the sun, and the sun, what it means the sun, what it means the moon, what it means the seasons, and how we give this deification of the sun and deification of the moon, and eventually became a deification of everything in one single figure. So that's one aspect of why approach nature.
Understanding the laws of nature.
Understanding nature, we wouldn't even call it laws. Laws was the laws of God, but not of nature. I mean,
by laws, but it was a certain method.
How it works, how nature works. And that's why the law and the 12 commandments are about. It's like, okay, that's how it works. That's how I should behave in this nature. That's the right thing to behave. So science breaks with the whole thing in a way they say, no, wait. It's not about interpreting nature. It's about knowing nature. And we don't know anything about it. We start from zero. So therefore, we start from zero. We need to explore how we can know things that we are certain they're right.
Well, I think I would make a distinction between first understanding the rules of the game. And by game, I mean the way economics works, the way social relations work, the way
psychology,
large groups of people cope, or how the other individual works, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
But then deriving from that a certain relation to it. And not just relation of sort of coping or working with it, but also there's a certain aspiration of improving our relation to it. So societies they're not only surviving, but we're trying to optimize the way the constructions are done or houses are built or the traffic is organized or environment is being let's say the environmental emissions are being regulated, so it's not going to harm nature, and at the same time it will optimize for human flourishing.
Yes.
But there a lot of this comes back to the principles. What are and from principles we go to values, because your values may differ from mine, so your optimal outcome can be very different from my desired outcome. Because if you say, well, your optimal outcome is a societal well-being and my optimal outcome is the individual's well-being, there is certainly an overlap there, but not necessarily the same path.
So let me deconstruct what you're saying, because there's a lot of things there.
Okay.
And the first thing is what you said about the relationship with nature. It's not only about understanding it, it's the relationship we have with it and how we can flourish in it. So there are two different things here. One is the relationship, and one is the flourishing.
Exactly.
And that reminds me, and that's just to stop in that first. That reminds me of how we approach science. There is this discipline in academic discipline called STS. It's that Science, Technology, and Technology Studies. STS. They call it sometimes philosophy of science and technology. Basically, what it says is that how we approach science and technology is very positivist. Like that science as it is, what it is outside us, we don't have any influence on how science works. We have a method, and the method works in this way. We cannot do anything about it. That's a way of looking at science. However, science at the end is a construction of the human being. It's the way we use as human beings to interpret reality. So therefore, already in itself, is a relationship with nature. So that's one of the aspects of relationship. So science, even the way we try to understand reality, nature, is already a construction, and it's not it's not something that is determining itself. It's something we decide according to our principles, our values. So it doesn't mean that science, there's only one method, but the way what we do with that method can change according to the situations we are. For example, if we live in a capitalist society where individual freedom is important, you're going to create more, you're going to put stress on developing science that goes towards the development of the car. Because the car is, at the end, is an expression of the individual freedom, because we have transportation that is individual. If you, however, believe in a collective and not the individual, the car is not important, so the science and technology related to the car is not going to be developed. You're going to develop science and technology that are related with to the construction of buildings for the collective, for example, better construction elements, materials. It doesn't mean that the nature doesn't exist there, but the relationship you have with that nature that's what technology is about, after all.
So what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is partly where do you choose to direct your attention?
Yes, absolutely. And
because
your attention and therefore your effort.
And therefore your effort.
Your collective effort. And then we come back again to the collectives. How we as a collective, where we decide to go according to the first principles, the values.
So what we're trying to do is peel off some of those layers, because ultimately you could say, well, I want to understand more how the ocean works.
Yeah.
And then you might ask, why?
Yes.
No? Because in and by itself, understanding how the ocean works. Well, because ultimately I want to do some shipping there, or want to put undersea cables for internet.
Yes.
So there's this very pragmatic outcome that I want to get out of it.
Material development progress.
Because you could say we're a coastal fishing village in Portugal, and we want to live in harmony with the low tides and the high tides and the tsunamis and everything else. You don't live in harmony with tsunamis, but you get my point.
You could maybe there's a way that energy wise you can. But put another example: the personal computer. Personal computer is a great example. The personal computer was developed in the United States for a reason, not in the USSR. The USSR didn't develop the personal computer. Why? Because the personal computer is the final expression of the individual freedom. I have a computer I can access to as an individual. So that's why I want to work on chips and materials, and there are companies dedicated to that, because that's going to give money to me, because people are interested in that, because the values of the collective are I want to be individually separated from the rest as an individual. In the USSR, you couldn't develop companies that do that because you don't have a market to develop that, because nobody's going to buy them. So therefore, the values in itself are going to define where to go. The same with the ocean aspect. Why a society is investing time in studying oceans? There's always a practical aspect, because that society wants to exploit maybe the ocean and wants to use the ocean for their own benefit, but also because there's a certain knowledge. But massive exploitation of the collective nowadays in our world plays a very important role in why do we develop science and technology, definitely. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yes. I absolutely get your point. I'm just thinking for 1 second, when you say, well, there's the collective, and you take USSR as a counterexample. Yeah. When you take personal liberty, and I realize now, when I use the term personal flourishing, that is not necessarily an overlapping term. So you can be completely free but miserable, or you can be, flourishing. Define flourishing. Is that happiness? Is that fulfillment? Is that health? Mental health and physical health and some basic level of material well-being, et cetera, et cetera. So, yes, what do you...
It is an interesting aspect, because this is in a way what communists were saying, in a way. I'm telling you why. Because your freedom, if there is no flourishing, is not valuable. And this is in a way is communist in itself, because that's what from the communism perspective of the individual flourishing, because your flourishing affects the collective flourishing.
Right.
So it's like it's the way of, as a state, I have to take care that you're flourishing. You see, as the freedom itself, you have the right to be miserable if you want to. You have the right to be miserable. There's nothing wrong on being miserable, because you're free to be miserable. As long as you're free to be miserable, it's fine. The problem is when you are miserable, not because of your freedom, but against your freedom. See, that's the difference between a liberal and a more collectivist ideology that says, as if you're not flourishing, I need to do something about it. I need to restrict your freedom.
I just think for a second, how the hell does the European Union work with 27 member states
Yes.
who are very diverse? And again, we're on this small, tiny continent. If you zoom out on a global map, you say how tiny Europe is. And yet we have here 27 countries. And these fundamental questions are, or had been there from the get-go. They are there now even in a more pronounced way because cultures change and societies change. And cultures are also prone to external manipulation or propaganda and just simple culture shifts.
There's one reason, in my opinion, why it works. And you'll be shocked, but not so much.
Tell me.
It's called Christianity. That's the fundamental values that we share are coming from Christianity.
Judeo-Christian, I would put it this way,
That's
right?
for Judeo-Christianity. I mean, yeah, Judeo-Christianity values, I think, and how, I mean, we're talking about thousands of years of build-up, maybe even before Christ. I mean, there's a build-up of, Christ is from a tradition that comes even before him.
Yeah.
So it comes from before. So that tradition is what informs the continent. And the continent, and we're talking of first principles. The values of EU are based on Judeo-Christian culture. And it's not conservative to say that, I think. It's not about, these are important for you, X and Y. I'm definitely not for me in terms of religion because I never been from a religious, I'm not from a religious family, quite the opposite.
But we're not talking religion.
I'm talking culture.
Exactly.
And values and first principles. And we share all those.
Yes.
And then that's what built our common aspect that I think we find a commonality in that. Our values are based on that. It's not coincidence that Christian Democrats were at the base of the building up of the EU, of the European communities.
I 100% agree with that. And I do recall when there was the constitutional treaty being negotiated and being discussed and what a big issue it was, dare I say scandal, whether to put that in there as a preamble that Europe has been built on these traditions. And I remember it was looked at from a religious perspective and saying these are secular societies and church and state have been separated. Yes, we're talking culture and traditions and most importantly values. And I think you can pinpoint those traditions to that legacy.
Definitely.
Or the values to that legacy, which still carries over to this day. So yes, I understand. Well, the EU with many cracks and insane difficulties and challenges and differences in which direction the countries want to take it to. And I think that's where the part of the reason why it has become so complicated and complex these days is that even if the foundations are there and there is broadly, save for a few countries which are increasingly playing along or decreasingly playing along, so not playing by those rules. But the bottom line is there, the cooperation is there on many aspects. Now the big question is when the values start to differ and we're no longer talking about an internal market, we're not talking about the trade aspects and the product harmonization and the four freedoms and so on, but when we're talking societal questions on be that immigration and be that minority rights and be that a host of other questions.
LGBTQ rights and abortion problems. That I think there's
take abortion or take euthanasia or you take too many of those questions. And I think those questions are very diverse or looked at in a very diverse way in different European countries. And I think that's fine. The challenge / problem, depending on where you sit in that debate, comes from the real or perceived desire of EU-level rules around these, where the member states are so different. I mean, you take Ireland. I think abortion was it even divorce was illegal for.
Well, in Spain it was illegal until 1982 or 81. So.
Wow, and then you take abortion, which again I think in Ireland was illegal for until very recently.
Very recently, definitely.
Very recently. So.
Again, you mean Liechtenstein? There was one of the last, if not the last, country in the world that gave the voting rights to women in 2000 and something. I think it was very recently. I don't know. Maybe.
Liechtenstein is not an EU member, but
No, it's not.
close enough.
But it's Europe. That's why it's Europe.
yeah.
Liechtenstein was. I don't remember exactly the year. It was told that it was very recently. It was not very.
Well, you take a couple of Swiss laws, for instance,
Yeah.
about what they allow about mosques being built or not. And
Again,
immigration
the voting
questions,
rights of
stuff like that.
women was given very quite late in 1970s in Switzerland.
Yeah. So again, what we're trying to find here is so this diversity, which again, it's a bit like a pyramid, but
Yeah.
Sam Harris uses that term, the moral landscape, and the reason why he uses that term is because there are peaks and lows according to different cultures or geographies or places where you do want to get to a certain height, but I think at a certain point, above a certain point, it can differ. It's not like a one-size-fits-all when it comes to certain social issues and social questions. And if I apply that for Europe, that's where we are. We do want to have a baseline where minorities are protected, and we want to have a freedom of speech, and we want to make sure that there's a level playing field in many ways, while accounting for cultural differences, which are really based on tradition, where we started from.
Yeah.
Catalonia, Spain,
definitely.
and all the rest.
The thing is that I do think there are common values that we share. They are intimately linked with a religious aspect. And I think there's certain awareness about it, about that history.
We use religious aspects, or would say maybe religious traditions or teachings or
rituals
values?
and religious ideologies, basically. So a religious ideology, that is Christianity, is a religious ideology, and it had a specific power relationship with individuals in Europe, and that imprinted the individual, the culture of people, and they have a relationship to that. And that creates a reaction, might be a positive reaction or a negative reaction, and there is a reaction to that in Europe. So therefore, the secularization of societies, when we secularize ourselves. The problem is that in a way, we are throwing the baby with the dirty water. We say, okay, I believe in secularization. I think not only the state, society should be secularized because religions should be an individual aspect. But that's my belief of what religion should be. It should be an individual idea and should not be imposed to anyone. And when you have a collective imposing a specific religion, specific rituals to a specific space, you are imposing that religion in one way or the other. So secularization is important. The thing is that there are many aspects of that ideology that are separate from the ideology. We're talking the cultural aspects of it. Yeah. And if we don't really separate them, we're going to break them. And we're going to attack them because we think they're part of that thing we have negative relationship with, the religion. That's why, let's put the case of Hungary, for example. The Hungarian ideology today, dominant, is protective of certain, even Poland, a big part of Poland, of what we call conservative ideas. But those conservative ideas are at the base of how we build Europe beyond the religion itself. And if you destroy them, you attack them, you're actually attacking what puts the glue that brings people together. You're only attacking the abortion rights itself or the anti-abortion. The people are anti-abortion. You're attacking the idea why people are like that and what's the origin of that. And you need to understand it. It doesn't mean that you need to agree with them. But understanding them, perhaps you agree on an aspect that it's a common aspect that comes from the same cultures, not necessarily religious. You're not making yourself more anti-abortion because you listen to the other. And we need to have that conversation. We need to have that conversation that we built. Again, I think it's a first principles conversation. Say, what are the principles that are basic for us? And then we actually share. And that's what I think the EU should be doing. The problem with the EU today is that secularization has gone to a way that it's bureaucratization. We are bureaucratizing Europe. And that doesn't have any emotional attachment. What
do you mean by that?
The meaning that EU is, it's been told many times that the EU is built on the idea that we need to create rules. The idea, it's what I was saying, the EU is institutions and rules. But we are abusing this idea, the idea of abusing. We are abusing so much the idea that if you are only building an EU that is based on institutions and rules and you're stuck into that, you are not really linking yourself to the principles that are at the base of the EU. You need to link yourself to that. And I think some politicians are doing. I think von der Leyen, personally, I really think she's great in ways that beyond what you can think, but in the way she deals with what the EU is today and the president of the Commission is, I think she's doing a great job. Because she is not only a bureaucrat. This is someone that wants to interpret what the EU is beyond the bureaucracy of the EU. And wants to at least participate in the creation of this identity. You might disagree or agree, but at least you are having that conversation. What makes the EU what the EU is?
And with Hungary aside, because I could say a lot about that, but in terms of its political setup and situation, and the government is not the people, but yeah, there are many things where they tap into common sentiments. What I wanted to highlight here is how, well, will we look at it from top down or bottom up?
Yeah.
Because top down meaning when rules being imposed on people where large parts of society are essentially not for it, they don't appreciate it, or is it rooted in culture? Is it rooted in that popular demand?
Absolutely.
And then it trickles up, doesn't trickle down, but kind of goes up and is propelled up to become a law because that's the will of the people. Now, of course, populists are exploiting it left, right, and center, where they say, we are the will of the people. We are just only putting into law what society demands, often focusing on just a small fragment of society. But in an ideal state, it's really something, so rules are not artificially created or even against the way a society wants to operate.
Yeah.
Because if you say in Catalonia has a certain way of living and doing things, a good governance and a good government would actually resonate with that and not necessarily come up with things that are very alien to
top-down approach to these cultural aspects and values that we share in communities. If you think of the EU as a conglomeration of communities and different cultures that we share things in common, but we are still different cultures, and it is diversity. And I think that's why I believe very much in this decentralization. I believe in decentralization because decentralization, again, it can be abused. Everything can be abused. But I think decentralization allows you to, at least in that specific territory, specific community, or the way they live, it is interpreted, the rules through their view. Point.
Is centralization the right term here? Isn't it?
Decentralized.
Okay.
Decentralized. Not centralized. Decentralized.
Because I was going to say that coordination, because it's ultimately a coordination problem.
Yes.
That's where we start.
I mean, yes and no, because I think there's a coordination thing, but it's also I don't think coordination is enough. You need authority too.
Yeah.
And coordination sometimes lacks authority. So you need still a certain centralization of certain aspects. And I think the EU lacks that. I think the EU should have more power, but paradoxically, it also should have less power. See, there's some aspects of the EU that I think is too much and some aspects that are too little. The EU should have more authority, but at the same time should give more authority. The member states should give more authority to different regions.
Yeah. It's a coordination problem, but to answer to that problem or the solution to it is indeed having strong rules, but again, strong enforcement powers in those limited number of fields.
Yeah.
So let me throw that back to you. Yeah. So which areas do you think the EU could or should have more power, and where it should have less?
That's okay. What I think it should have not more power, but at least more coordination. There's coordination is taxation. Taxation, I think, should be more coordinated among the member states. Not at the level that we have common taxes and we have a common. I don't think it will never work, and it's not advisable. But I think at least a more elements of discussing taxation and taking decisions in common that goes beyond the European EU taxes like VAT and levies and custom duties. This is what the EU is doing. They have their own part, their own revenue, and then they don't really discuss this aspect. I think taxation could be discussed at the level of the EU, and we can coordinate more. That's a coordination problem, I think, in taxation. But in terms of authority, for example, I think defense is one aspect. Foreign policy is one aspect. Foreign policy is definitely an aspect. We need more authority. We need a foreign affairs minister of the EU.
Like a proper one.
Like a secretary of state.
I mean, nothing bad to say about Kaja Kallas, but in terms of the possibilities legally and politically speaking.
Yes, it doesn't have any authority. No authority whatsoever. And even the title itself is terrible. High representative, it looks like a colonial title or a human rights commissioner. And it's how we call the Bosnia representative Cal built in 1995, a high representative in Bosnia for Bosnia. I mean, that's a high representative. That's not a title to give to someone that should be representing the EU all over the world. I saw how the Callas was talking in the United Nations. He was talking there, and he say high representative. When I saw that picture, I say, he looks so bad.
Not serious.
It's not serious. High representative. It's like, who is going to listen to a high representative?
Yeah, but what they say is foreign policy is toothless without an army, and every member state has some.
And that's why I say defense, and
government.
I think we should have a common army.
But not a common army, yeah.
We need to have a common army. We need to have a common army. We have to have a common foreign policy. That, however, common army doesn't mean that the member states don't have to have their own. I mean, in a way, the model of the United States is not bad. I mean, they have the national guards. The state have national guards. It has to be stronger than that. We cannot compare. It's not the same. The history of the United States with the EU. It's definitely not going to be the same. Right. But I think the armies of, at least you can keep the armies of the EU, of each member state, but you need to have at least one common army that for specific reasons, for specific tasks. Well, we used to be called the Petersburg tasks, and this is operations outside. I think the EU, and also for defense, certain aspects of defense with NATO or with other organizations we could have in the future.
I think that's a conversation on its own, a fascinating conversation on its own, because the EU is certainly at a historic moment at this point where there's tremendous pressure basically from East and West, East being Russia, West being the US or the US administration at this point, in different ways. And yet the EU is being squeezed from multiple, and inside, because inside there are political challenges and demographic challenges and competitiveness challenges and a host of others. So the point is, at this point, it's a very, very difficult moment in European history. And the EU's history, which is still being written, and we are participants to it, or to a large degree, we are exposed to it, even though we are very close physically to the institutions and we know many people there. My point is, how that's going to play out is it can go both ways, and it's not necessarily just a binary thing, but it can collapse under that pressure. It can fragment under that pressure, but it might make it much closer, that cooperation. And my point, I wrote an article, or I put it on LinkedIn a couple of days ago, on this, where how the EU is going to come out of it, well, it needs to focus. Yes. And it needs to let go of certain areas, policy-wise speaking, where it just doesn't have the bandwidth or the resources or the attention to deal with.
Like what? Is that?
Well, that could be perhaps on certain aspect of social policy or employment aspects or certain things where member states are doing their own rules. You can do some basic stuff. I'm a big proponent of helping cultural project and things. Yes, important, but the mindset, at least for the next foreseeable few years, has to be a war mindset. Yeah. And just on my way, I was listening to a conversation where I heard a speech, I think it was a Dutch foreign minister or defense minister, doesn't matter, who said, well, we're not in a war, but we are not at peace either. Yeah. We are somewhere in this gray zone, and it's a dangerous place to be. He even gave the example of a hybrid car is like a hybrid warfare. Well, it's after all a car, and it's warfare. So take that adjective away and just keep the word. And that needs to inform the EU's attention, going back to our choice, and the value choice, because the value, you really go lower down on the Maslow pyramid of hierarchy. Yeah. Survival, safety, physical safety, psychological safety, and the survival of survival of the EU or survival of the countries. Of course, the two are interlinked, but both are vital.
I agree with you. I think we need to focus. The thing is that there's always a trade-off. Everything is a trade-off. There's no solutions, actually, only trade-offs. I think, Thomas Sowell, economist for Harvard, I think he is fantastic in the way that he says there are no solutions to things, there are only trade-offs. If you take from here, you have to give here, you have to take from somewhere.
Opportunity cost.
It's always everything. I mean, there's no final solution to anything. There's no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And if you can take from the social aspects of the EU, though it's not so big. I mean, it's still tiny compared to the rest. Agriculture is much bigger. Agriculture is the main.
When we talk budget, I'm more
okay. You're talking about the
human
focus, the
resources,
political,
focus, political
okay.
will, and
well, the thing is that
and again, just as a caveat, these are very important areas. I'm not discounting them in that regard.
Friction, because that discourse that I agree with is not shared by many people in Europe because of the history we came from. I mean, we are still what you can call the butter history, bread and butter history. Okay. I mean, everything is bread and butter, but there is no metal, there is no cutlery around. I mean, everything is really nice, everything is for bread, everything is butter, but you need some knives and things to defend yourself. So the bread and butter means that you have the bread and butter, but you know where it comes from, you know how it came to your table, and that's what the United States was providing, the safety net to have that bread and butter on the table, and people come from that. So meaning that if you start cutting from that, and I mean, I saw it from people that have certain influence socially, politically. They say, we don't need armies to have safety. We only need schools and hospitals.
I envy their naivety.
It's so ignorant. It's so ignorant. Again, I mean, it's not really, it's ignorance. It's definitely ignorance because you don't have hospitals and schools until you don't defend the territory. You actually build the hospitals and schools.
Well, you look at Ukraine, you look at Kherson, you look at a couple of places.
Exactly. I mean, I think this is not like Europe. That's not. It doesn't count, or it's because of the Russians. It's because it's Russians. It's Russians attacked. Yeah, but Russians is not because they're Russians. It's because this reality as it is, and it's not like they identify the world as bad and good. So these are the bad people that create problems. I'm the good person. So if we eliminate the bad people, then we only have good people, and then everything is solved. How we remove the bad people? By hospitals and education. That's how it works. So the world doesn't work this way. There always will be what you call bad people, because there always will be bad situations and always will create conflict. So you need things to protect people that are in their own life and they're having a healthy life from people that actually create a healthy situation. You need that.
I immediately connect back that concept, that idea, which I very much agree with, to how the world works.
Yeah,
how nature works, and unfortunately, we need to face how human nature works. And human nature, and we can take the view of Rousseau, and say humans are inherently good. Yes, the vast majority of them are, but you do have Putins, and you do have.
I personally don't take Rousseau. I think Rousseau was an idealist.
Yeah,
I think we are not bad or good. We are what it is.
Yeah, but
it's like
again,
it's nature and saying nature is what it is. I mean. A tiger is going to eat you alone, or maybe some.
That's a great thing because you're part of the food chain. So after all, nature is doing what nature does.
It's not a good thing. There is a great.
It's pretty bad for you. It can ruin your day if you're eaten by a tiger.
Exactly.
But in the grand scheme of things, it's how things operate.
It's nothing. I like this speech of Alan Watts. You know Alan Watts?
No.
The Tao philosopher from 1970s and 80s. Have a look at that. It's a fantastic speeches. And he was a Taoist. And he has this speech all over YouTube, and you have different videos. And I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember exact details. Basically, you have this farmer in China, and then the son of the farmer has an accident, and he breaks the leg. Right. And all the neighbors comes, oh, poor you, your son breaks the leg, so poor you. And the farmer says, I don't know if it's good or bad. We will see. And then there is a war between China and the neighbors, and then they come to pick his son, but the son has a broken leg, so they cannot pick him up. They say, "Oh, you're so lucky, your son is not going to war." Say, "Yeah, we don't know," but and then everything happens. Nothing is bad or good in itself. It's like it's the consequences that could be bad or good for depending on in which part of those consequences you are. As you say, for the tiger, it's a good thing you're being eaten. For you, it's a very bad thing. Is that a good or bad thing? No, it's nothing. But it's just what it is.
And I think this topic of from value filters or value judgment all the way to how you relate to it, I think that's a gigantic. It's a door that I was hoping to open today. A door I was hoping to open because when we sat down here, I said, "Well, you have that other side," and you hinted at that because just as a teaser, because I'm sure not just sure, I'm actually already saying it. There will be a second conversation and probably more because I really wanted to talk with you about your other hat, and that's I don't even know how to describe it. Is that the yoga hat?
I call it spiritual. I
retreat
mean,
into
it sounds like
spiritual
yeah,
had-
I would say spiritual. It sounds like a common place to say spiritual, but I like that aspect of it. I think it's a spiritual because I think we all have spirits, like and spiritual path, and we might not know it, but we do spiritual things. I mean, it might not healthy for you. That's what you're doing, but it's still spiritual in terms of what is spirituality. Spirituality is what it is not, what is over you. So it's a connection of yourself with what it is not you, or what you think it is not you, and that could
your place in the world.
your place in what it is not you. I mean, exactly, or how you relate. Exactly how you relate to spirituality is the relation you have with nature, with reality. That's what spirituality is.
Yeah.
That can be defined. And coming back to what you were saying, definitely.
And again, just to define, I mean, nature is not Saint-Contenaire Park. Well, that's also nature, but nature as in, you said, the outside world.
Yeah,
and that
so
could be
the universe.
The universe, zooming out from planet Earth. But your place in kind of
your relationship with it, how you relate to the universe, I think that's a perfect definition for spirituality.
Your place in the world.
And we all,
being
even if you don't know it, you are relating to every single second, millisecond of your life, you're relating to the universe. And you might do it with awareness or without awareness, conscious awareness, or not, but you're doing it because that's the thing as it is. That you cannot change that.
That's how
you wouldn't exist. If we
that's how we operate.
Yeah,
in this
we exist because
system.
we have that relationship with the universe because we are part of it. And then that's when you enter to your belief of how do you believe you relate to that, and then that's your spiritual path. Already the beginning of that belief is the beginning of your spiritual path. How you relate to that. You believe there's a God outside you that is superior to you, or you believe that you're a part of the whole universe and you are that. No,
you're just a bunch of atoms.
There are a bunch of atoms.
Around.
That's a spiritual belief. I mean, believing that you're a bunch of atoms as material, that's a spiritual belief. Because that's how you interpret your relationship with the universe. In my book, in my perspective, that's what I would call spirituality. It's not about burning incense at your home and then doing yoga poses and meditating every morning. Well, it's an important method, all of those.
It's a method.
It's a method.
Because that's
to relate to the universe.
To relate and to
find your place, as you say.
To open that door.
Yes.
And start exploring what it holds.
With the tools you have available. That's your mind,
that's
body.
That's the toolkit.
Yeah.
Well, I think despite my best intentions that we would go into that
would
direction.
Be a good connection for the next
But I think it's indeed more of a teaser for the next next conversation, because I loved our conversation because we went in so many directions and from high level to very personal. But again, we're going to come back to this.
Yes.
There is so much to say, and you have a lot to say, and I'm extremely curious in your experience, because you've done multiple retreats and
I lived in Thailand 2 years for I was teaching yoga there, and I was meditating, doing all type of stuff. Some of them I cannot talk about because they're not things you normally talk in public. So, but many other stuff there you can be.
Yes, and of course the main interest, aside from what you did there and how it was, and drinking coconut juice 24 hours a day, but
I had a fridge in my kitchen. My kitchen was outside. It was a cabin, the wooden cabin with a wonderful view of the view, and the kitchen was outside. I have a fridge. It was basically in the fridge. I only had coconuts, like full coconuts, and I had an axe, and I was cutting the coconut every morning. And cut my coconut. It was amazing.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna buy my plane ticket right now. But that's part of it of how you lived and what you did. But even more importantly, perhaps, is what you learned and the kind of insights you've gained and how you understand this part of the universe. So that's where we're gonna continue next time. And I really appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Hannes. Thank you. Excellent.